Hello, my name is Shantikiran Schnall, and I am from the state of Texas in the United States of America. And today I'll be presenting my project, Elephonic, a novel approach towards the detection of elephant rumbles and the prevention of poaching using machine learning. Earth's biodiversity is increasingly under threat as sources of anthropogenic change continue to drastically shift our landscapes. One of the species most affected by human interference is the African forest elephant. It is estimated that there are only 350,000 elephants left in Africa, with approximately 15,000 elephants being killed each year by poachers seeking their valuable tusks. In the last decade itself, the population has fallen more than 60%, leaving African elephants in an endangered status. In this state, population monitoring is critical to ensure the elephant's survival. However, manually monitoring tropical forests is intractable due to the lack of resources and effectiveness. Possible methods of achieving the monitoring of elephant populations include placing GPS collars around elephant necks. However, this method is very intrusive on an elephant's life, and the amount of resources needed to accomplish this makes it infeasible. Another rising method of detection is the usage of drones, as you can see to the right. However, this approach is also flawed, as the amount of electricity and funding needed to accomplish this makes it inapplicable. In light of these problems, it is clear that the development of a feasible and reliable method of monitoring is necessary. And here is where recent developments in bioacoustics shine. In 1984, Katie Payne discovered that elephants communicate acoustically in frequencies below the range of human hearing, in a range commonly known as infrasound. The application of deep learning towards the conservation of wildlife has been very limited as public interest has strayed away from this topic, when in actuality, it holds the greatest potential in this field. Over the past few years, great advancements in processing power and research lead to the development of machine learning and audio processing. The application of machine learning and audio processing allows us to analyze sounds and determine the presence of elephants in an area. Using state-of-the-art techniques in artificial intelligence and a large professionally labeled data set of passive acoustic recordings of the African forest elephant, we can successfully detect an elephant's presence by essentially listening in on their conversations. This strategy of PAM, passive acoustic monitoring, is a non-intrusive method of monitoring an area. Additionally, this method is very feasible as microphones have become much less expensive over time, and the cost of a microcomputer is also minor in comparison to the current techniques used. By attaching a microcomputer to microphones spaced radially over 1 kilometer radii, we can accurately and effectively detect the presence of an elephant herd. Not only is this technique non-intrusive, but it is also a preventative method of anti-poaching measures, as it can prevent the activity of poaching before it actually occurs. This advancement could potentially revolutionize wildlife conservation, as this same technology can be transferred and applied towards other endangered species. Now, in the beginning of my project, the first roadblock that I came across is that I could not find any data set of elephant rumbles. And this means without a data set, I was kind of lost on a path with no direction. Because when you're training a machine learning model, you're always going to need an annotated data set that the model can train on and become better at predicting. However, without a data set, I was essentially lost. Now, one solution that I came up with was using unsupervised machine learning, or an anomaly detection or cluster-based approach. But the thing about this approach is that it could lead to a lot of misleaded predictions because it relies on grouping together patterns of noises, and essentially those groups of noises could potentially have elephant rumbles or could not also potentially have elephant rumbles, which means they are very unpredictable and makes it more unreliable. So throughout this time going through my roadblock, I had to find different ways to get around this. However, luckily I came across the Cornell University and Elephant Listening Project. I emailed this organization, and the professor over there responded back to me, and he was able to give me tons of support by providing me with annotated data and interpretations and a guidebook on how to use the data and predict where elephants are present. And as you can see to the right, those red dots represent how microphones were spaced out over the area of the Congo forest. And each of those microphones is actively listening on the environment, and all of the sound is uploaded onto an open database. Now, from this open database, what Cornell University and the Elephant Listening Project did is they hired researchers to go through and annotate only a small portion of this data, because currently there are over 50 terabytes. They could only annotate about 140 gigabytes of data, but that was more than enough to complete this project. And as you can see in the picture to the left with an arrow pointing, that actually represents the module that records all the sounds that are occurring in the area. And in this area, there's a huge presence of elephants, and we can actually see the rumbles that are going on as researchers go through the data set and annotate it. Now, the first step in using this data was to download and analyze the data set features. Now, the open data set was located on AWS Open Data, and essentially this 50 terabyte data set only had around 140, 130 gigabytes of usable audio that was annotated for all the elephant rumbles that were available in each of the locations. And each of the files were around 24 hours long and a gigabyte large. Now, the first way in analyzing the data set is by separating each of the rumbles by location and analyzing which locations had the least amount of rumbles. The locations with the least amount of rumbles could be ignored and deleted because we don't have that much space on our computer and RAM capacity to run all the calculations with all the rumbles, with all the different files being stored into the RAM. So the files with the least amount of RAM with the least amount of rumbles can be deleted to save RAM storage and allow for a model to actually be developed. Now, the second process of this is reducing the size of our data set. Essentially, all that 140 gigabytes of data with the software and hardware limitations that I have, there was no way that I could analyze all the 140 gigabytes of data and make possible conclusions out of it. And additionally, there's a lot of unnecessary data because we were only looking at low frequency areas. And because of this, we could essentially lose all the high definition data that we don't actually need, because low definition data does not require that many samples, or essentially samples represent the amount of frames per second in which an audio is recorded. If the frames per second is less, it can pick up the lower frequencies, but if in order to pick up higher frequencies, the frames per second has to be much higher. And that's what we call the sample rate. If we can decrease the sample rate from around 8,000 to 1,000, we were able to decrease the amount of noise available in the data set, which means that our machine learning model can train much faster and be much more accurate because it does not have the extra noise and the high-pitched sounds in the area. And as you can see in the diagram below, it represents what downsampling means. So you can see that there's a lot of samples in the highest diagram, but when they downsample it, they ignore the samples in between so that only the low samples are available. This means that we only have low frequency noise available. Now, once we downsample, we had to process the audio into something that can be processed in a machine learning model. Now, what we did to do this is by processing it through a Fourier transform. And what the Fourier transform did is it took the analog audio signals and transferred it into a spectrogram format, which essentially allows us to view another dimension, which is intensity and frequency. Now, with all these three dimensions, it essentially allows a machine learning model to go through and use all the data in order to actually process that into a machine learning model. Now, after doing this part, what I had to do is generate a complete data set, because what was available to me were basically just timestamps of where rumbles were located and the actual files of the sounds. So I had to experiment a lot with the algorithms for this. The conversion of spectrograms into a single channel or black and white allows me to once again reduce the amount of data that I'm using and make it much more accurate in that it reduces the amount of noise available in the spectrogram. I also created a randomizing algorithm that generated a separate set of data for an area without elephant rumbles, because I had to single out areas without elephant rumbles and then use that area to randomize different locations and take spectrograms in those areas. Now, the training of my models, I chose to train 5 of them, and I compared them with each other: the support vector machine, random forest model, AdaGrad model, CNN model, and DenseNet model. And we found that the DenseNet model was able to classify with the highest accuracy, and this showed the true success of machine learning in this field, because it shows how it can almost classify at a higher rate than even a researcher. And this means that it automates the process of detecting where elephants are located just based on the sound of it. And this means that we can monitor populations much more efficiently and effectively than before if it was implemented onto an IoT device. And I was also able to beat many different other research papers, and currently this is the highest accuracy in which an elephant rumble is detected. Now, moving on towards my implementation, what I did was implement this machine learning model onto a Raspberry Pi that connected to a microphone. Now, what the Raspberry Pi serves to do is it takes the audio signals and passes it through the Raspberry Pi. And whether there's an elephant rumble there, if there is, then it'll upload that rumble onto a server or database. And on that database can be further analyzed to essentially locate where different rumbles are going on, and it can be sent over to wildlife conservationists for further analysis. Now, further studies can be done on this to analyze migration patterns and many other different things that can further save elephants' lives. And this is my method for saving many different elephants from poaching. And thank you for listening to my presentation.